The rain started as a gentle whisper against the cobblestones, but by evening it had grown into a relentless downpour that turned the streets of Millbrook into rushing rivers. Elena Vasquez pressed herself against the wooden door of the boarding house, her knuckles raw from knocking, her voice hoarse from pleading. "Please, Mrs. Hartford," she called through the thick oak, "I have nowhere else to go, just for tonight." The response came swift and cold through the door. "I told you before, girl, no payments, no room. And after what happened with the Hendersons, no decent person in this town will take you in." Elena's shoulders sagged as she stepped back from the door. Water dripped from her dark hair, which had escaped from its careful bun hours ago. Her simple brown dress, the only decent one she owned, was now soaked through and clinging to her thin frame. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it provided little warmth against the October chill. The Hendersons. Even thinking their name made her stomach twist with a mixture of anger and despair. 3 weeks ago she had been their housemaid, sleeping in a small but warm attic room, earning honest wages for honest work. She had been careful, so careful, to keep her sleeves rolled down, to never let them see what lay beneath the fabric. But accidents happen, especially when you're carrying a heavy pot of boiling water up narrow stairs. When she had stumbled and the pot had tilted, splashing scalding liquid across her forearm, she had instinctively rolled up her sleeve to assess the burn. Mrs. Henderson, who had rushed to help, had frozen when she saw what decorated Elena's skin. The intricate black lines that spiraled from her wrist to her elbow weren't just random marks. They were symbols, carefully crafted and deeply meaningful. A serpent coiled around a blooming rose, with small stars scattered between the petals. Below it, in flowing script barely visible unless you knew where to look, were words in a language Mrs. Henderson didn't recognize but somehow feared. "Witch marks," Mrs. Henderson had whispered, backing away as if Elena might curse her on the spot. "Devil's writing." By morning, Elena's belongings had been packed and left on the front step. By noon, word had spread through the small town like wildfire. By evening, every door in Millbrook was closed to her. Now, 3 weeks later, Elena found herself with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a few coins that wouldn't even buy her a room for one night. She had tried everything, offering to work for food, to sleep in barns, to do anything that might earn her shelter. But fear ran deep in small towns, and the story of her markings had grown with each telling. She wrapped her arms around herself and began walking down the main street, her feet splashing through puddles that reflected the warm light spilling from windows she could never enter. The rain was coming down harder now, and she could feel it seeping through her shoes, making her toes numb with cold. The town square was empty except for a few carriages taking shelter under the old oak tree. Elena considered hiding beneath one of them, but she knew the drivers would chase her away if they found her. She had learned in these past weeks that kindness was a luxury most people couldn't afford when it came to those marked as different. As she walked, Elena's mind drifted to her grandmother, the woman who had raised her after her parents died in the cholera outbreak 12 years ago. Abuela Rosa had been the one to give Elena these markings, not with a needle and ink like the sailors who frequented the port towns, but with something far older and more mysterious. "These symbols," her grandmother had explained as she traced the designs onto Elena's skin with a brush dipped in a mixture that smelled of herbs and moonlight. "They are our family's protection. They tell our story, guard our secrets, and connect us to those who came before." Elena had been 16 then, old enough to understand that accepting these markings would mark her as different, but young enough to believe that love was stronger than fear. Her grandmother had been the village healer, sought out by people who needed remedies that doctors couldn't provide. But when the new priest arrived with his talk of demons and devil worship, everything changed. The night they came for her grandmother, Elena had hidden in the root cellar as instructed. She had listened to the shouts, the sound of breaking glass, the crackle of flames. When she finally emerged, the cottage was nothing but charred ruins, and her grandmother was gone. The villagers who had once begged for Rosa's help now spoke of her as if she had been evil all along. Elena had run that night, carrying only her grandmother's journal and the clothes on her back. For 2 years, she had wandered from town to town, always careful to hide her markings, always moving on before anyone could discover her secret. Millbrook was supposed to have been different. It was supposed to have been the place where she could finally stop running. The sound of horses' hooves on wet cobblestones pulled Elena from her memories. She looked up to see a grand carriage approaching, its black paint gleaming even in the rain. Golden crests decorated its doors, and the driver wore a uniform she didn't recognize. This wasn't a local carriage. It was something far more important. Elena quickly stepped to the side, pressing herself against the wall of the bakery. People like whoever rode in that carriage didn't like to be reminded that people like her existed. She had learned to make herself invisible when the wealthy and powerful passed by. But as the carriage rolled past, one of its wheels hit a deep puddle, sending a spray of muddy water directly onto Elena. She gasped and stumbled backward, her shawl falling away from her shoulders. For a moment she stood there in the lamplight, soaked and shivering, her sleeve torn where it had caught on the bakery's rough stone wall. The carriage stopped. Elena's heart hammered as she realized what had happened. In the struggle to keep from falling, her sleeve had been pushed up past her elbow. Her markings were clearly visible in the light from the carriage lanterns, the black ink seeming to move and shift on her pale, rain-soaked skin. A window in the carriage slid down, and a man's voice called out, "Driver, what was that? Why have we stopped?" Elena didn't wait to hear the response. She turned and ran, her feet slipping on the wet stones, her heart racing with panic. She had been seen. Soon there would be more than just closed doors to worry about. Soon there would be torches and angry voices and nowhere left to run. She ducked into an alley between 2 shops, pressing her back against the cold brick wall. The rain was falling even harder now, turning the narrow space into a small waterfall. But Elena barely noticed the cold or the wet. All she could think about was the carriage and who might have seen her markings and what they might do about it. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to move differently when you were afraid and alone. Elena's teeth were chattering so hard she was afraid someone might hear them from the street. Her fingers were turning blue, and she could no longer feel her feet in her sodden shoes. Just as she was beginning to wonder if she might simply freeze to death in this alley, she heard footsteps approaching. Slow, measured steps that stopped just at the mouth of the alley. Elena held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the shadows. "Miss?" a voice called softly. It was a man's voice, cultured and careful. "Miss, I know you're there. I'm not here to hurt you." Elena said nothing. In her experience, people who had to announce they weren't going to hurt you usually were. "My name is Captain Morrison," the voice continued. "I serve under General Blackwood. We saw what happened in the square. You're soaked through and freezing. Please, let us help you." Elena almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A captain and a general wanting to help someone like her? More likely, they wanted to drag her before a magistrate or worse. She had heard stories of what happened to women accused of witchcraft, even in these more modern times. "I know you're frightened," Captain Morrison said, and something in his tone made Elena pause. There was no threat in it, no anger or disgust, just a kind of sad understanding. "But you'll die out here in this weather. Whatever you think we might do to you, it can't be worse than freezing to death in an alley." Elena closed her eyes and tried to think. He was right about one thing. She would die out here. She could already feel her body shutting down, her thoughts becoming sluggish with cold. And there was something else, something that made her hesitate. When the carriage window had opened and the voice had called out, There had been something familiar about the tone. Not the words, but the accent, the way certain syllables were pronounced. It reminded her of someone, though she couldn't quite place who. "Miss," Captain Morrison called again, "I give you my word as an officer that no harm will come to you under our protection. The general merely wishes to speak with you." Elena's grandmother had always told her to trust her instincts, to listen to the voice inside that knew truth from lies. Right now, that voice was telling her that she had little choice. Stay here and die slowly in the cold and rain, or take a chance that these soldiers might be different from everyone else who had rejected her. Slowly, Elena stepped out of the shadows. The captain stood at the mouth of the alley, holding a large umbrella that did little good in the driving rain. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps only a few years older than her own 22 years, with kind eyes and a concerned expression. "Thank you," he said simply, extending his arm. "The carriage is just here." Elena hesitated one more moment, then walked toward him. As she did, she caught sight of her reflection in a shop window and nearly gasped. She looked like something that had crawled out of the river, her hair hanging in wet tangles, her dress torn and muddy, her skin pale as a ghost. No wonder he looked concerned. Captain Morrison helped her into the carriage with the careful politeness of a man who had been raised to treat all women as ladies, regardless of their station. The interior was warm and dry, with soft leather seats and brass fittings that gleamed in the lamplight. Sitting across from her was a man who could only be General Blackwood. He was older than the captain, perhaps in his 40s, with graying hair and sharp features. His uniform was immaculate despite the weather, and his bearing spoke of a man accustomed to command. But his eyes, when they met Elena's, held something she didn't expect. Recognition. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she studied his face more carefully. There was something about the line of his jaw, the shape of his nose, that seemed familiar, and when he spoke, that sense of familiarity grew stronger. "Miss," he said, his voice careful and controlled, "I'm General Blackwood. I apologize for the circumstances of our meeting, but I'm afraid I had little choice. When I saw your—" He paused, his gaze flicking to her exposed arm. "Your markings, I knew I had to speak with you immediately." Elena instinctively pulled her shawl over her arm, though she knew it was too late. He had seen. They had both seen. "I don't know what you think you saw," she said quietly, "but I assure you I'm just a woman looking for work. Nothing more." General Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Miss, those markings on your arm, where did you get them?" Elena's mind raced. Should she lie, make up a story about a sailor boyfriend or a rebellious youth? But something in the general's expression stopped her. There was no accusation there, no disgust or fear, just an intense, almost desperate curiosity. "They were given to me by my grandmother," she said finally, deciding that truth might be her only option now. "She said they were protection." The general's face went completely white. He stared at Elena for a long moment, then slowly rolled up his own sleeve. There, on his forearm, were markings that made Elena's blood run cold. They were similar to hers, but older and more faded. The same serpent, the same rose, but with additional symbols she didn't recognize. And at the bottom, in that same flowing script, were words that made her heart stop. Because she could read them. Because her grandmother had taught her that ancient language when she was just a child. And because the name written on General Blackwood's arm was one she had heard whispered in her dreams since she was small. "Rosa Elena Vasquez," the general read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was your grandmother's name." Elena nodded, unable to speak. The general rolled his sleeve back down and sat back in his seat, his face a mixture of wonder and something that looked like grief. "My dear child," he said softly. "I have been looking for you for a very long time." Elena stared at him, confusion and fear warring in her chest. "I don't understand," she managed. "Who are you? How do you know about my grandmother?" General Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, seeming to struggle with something. Finally, he looked up at Elena with eyes that were suddenly full of unshed tears. "My name," he said slowly, "is Marcus Blackwood. But 24 years ago, before I became a general, before I became someone important in this world, I was just a soldier who fell in love with a healer named Rosa. A woman who saved my life and marked me as her own before circumstances tore us apart." Elena felt the world tilt around her. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. "Rosa was pregnant when I had to leave," the general continued, his voice growing stronger. "She was carrying my child. I tried to return, but by the time I could get back to her village, it had been destroyed. Everyone said she was dead. Everyone said the baby was dead too." Elena's hand went to her throat, where beneath her dress hung a small pendant her grandmother had given her, a pendant with the initials MB carved into its silver surface. "But she wasn't dead," Elena whispered, understanding beginning to dawn. "She escaped. She had the baby. She had my daughter," General Blackwood said, his voice breaking slightly. "She had you." The carriage fell silent except for the sound of rain on the roof and Elena's ragged breathing. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about her family, about who she was, had just crumbled and reformed in the space of a few words. She looked at this man, this general, this stranger, this father she had never known, and felt a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't even name. Anger at being abandoned, relief at finally having answers, fear about what this all meant. "The night they came for her," Elena said slowly, "she made me hide. Before she died, she told me to find the man with matching marks. She said he would understand. She said he would protect me." General Blackwood closed his eyes, pain evident on his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I let you grow up alone and afraid. I'm sorry it took me this long to find you." Elena studied his face, looking for lies, looking for deception. But all she saw was genuine grief and regret, and something else. Hope. A desperate, fragile hope that maybe it wasn't too late to fix what had been broken so many years ago. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the carriage, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like she might finally be safe, like she might finally belong somewhere. But she had learned not to trust such feelings. The world had taught her that safety was an illusion and belonging was a luxury she couldn't afford. Even if this man was truly her father, even if he meant everything he was saying, that didn't mean her troubles were over. In fact, as Elena was about to discover, they were just beginning. 3 days later, Elena sat in a room that felt like a dream. The guest chamber in General Blackwood's estate was larger than any place she had ever called home, with thick carpets, heavy curtains, and a fireplace that kept the autumn chill at bay. Fresh clothes lay across the bed, dresses of fine fabric that actually fit her small frame, soft undergarments, even shoes that didn't pinch her feet. But comfort couldn't quiet the storm in Elena's mind. She held her grandmother's journal in her lap, its leather cover worn smooth from years of handling. Since learning the truth about her father, she had been reading it with new eyes, searching for any mention of Marcus Blackwood, any clue about their relationship that her grandmother might have hidden in her careful script. The journal was filled with recipes for healing potions, notes about the phases of the moon, and careful observations about which herbs worked best for which ailments. But scattered throughout were personal entries that Elena had never fully understood before. "My heart is torn in two," read one passage dated 23 years ago. He promises to return when his service is done, when he can choose his own path instead of following orders. But I know the child I carry will not wait for his freedom. I must decide. Tell him and watch him destroy his future trying to be with us, or let him go and raise our baby alone." Elena traced the words with her finger, finally understanding why her grandmother had always seemed sad when she spoke of Elena's father. Rosa had loved him enough to protect him from his own sense of duty. She had sacrificed her own happiness to keep him from sacrificing his. A knock at the door interrupted Elena's reading. "Come in," she called, quickly closing the journal. Captain Morrison entered, carrying a tea service on a silver tray. Over the past 3 days, he had been unfailingly kind and patient, answering Elena's questions about military life and serving as a buffer between her and the overwhelming reality of her new situation. "The general asked me to bring you this," he said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "He also wanted me to tell you that dinner will be served at 7 if you'd like to join him." Elena had taken her meals in this room since arriving, still too overwhelmed to face the formal dining room with its long table and elaborate place settings, but she knew she couldn't hide forever. "Captain Morrison," she said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, Miss Elena." "What kind of man is he? Really, I mean. Not the general, but the person underneath all the rank and ceremony." Captain Morrison was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "He's the finest man I've ever served under," he said finally. "Fair, honest, willing to listen to advice from those below him. He cares about his soldiers, not just as weapons in war, but as human beings with families and dreams." He paused, then continued. "But he's also a man carrying a great deal of guilt. He's never spoken of it directly, but I've seen the way he stares at letters he never sends, the way he disappears for hours on the anniversary of certain dates. Learning about you. It's given him something I don't think he ever hoped to have again." "Purpose beyond his duty?" Elena nodded, understanding more than she could easily express. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of revelations, not just about her parentage, but about the world her father inhabited. General Marcus Blackwood was not just any military officer. He was one of the king's most trusted advisors, a man whose decisions affected thousands of lives. "There's something else," Captain Morrison said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "The general wanted me to warn you that tomorrow we'll be hosting a dinner for some of his fellow officers and their wives. He'd like you to attend, but only if you feel ready." Elena's stomach tightened. "Why would he want me there?" "Because hiding you away serves no one," Captain Morrison said gently. "Your existence will become known eventually. Better to control that revelation than to let rumors and speculation grow on their own." After the captain left, Elena found herself pacing the room, nervous energy making it impossible to sit still. The idea of facing a room full of strangers, of being scrutinized and judged, filled her with dread. These would be people from her father's world, people who expected certain behaviors and mannerisms she had never learned. But more than that, she was afraid of disappointing him. Marcus Blackwood had spent 23 years thinking his daughter was dead. Now that he had found her, would she live up to whatever image he had built in his mind? Elena was still wrestling with these thoughts when another knock came at her door. This time it was Marcus himself, looking somewhat uncertain in a way that reminded her he was struggling with this situation as much as she was. "May I come in?" he asked. Elena nodded, gesturing to the chair across from where she sat by the window. Marcus settled himself carefully, his military bearing softening slightly in the informal setting. "I wanted to speak with you about tomorrow evening," he began. "Captain Morrison told me about the dinner," Elena said. "I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that." "I understand your hesitation," Marcus replied. "But Elena, I need you to understand something about our situation. My position comes with certain complications. There are people who would use any perceived weakness against me, and unfortunately, my having a daughter who was raised outside proper society could be seen as such a weakness. Elena felt a familiar sting of rejection, even though she knew he wasn't intending to hurt her. "You're ashamed of me," she said quietly. "No," Marcus said firmly, leaning forward. "Never think that. I'm proud to be your father, prouder than I have words to express. But I've learned that in this world, perception often matters more than truth. If we're going to protect you, if we're going to give you the life you deserve, we need to be strategic about how we present your background." Elena studied her father's face, seeing the conflict there. This was a man caught between his duty to his position and his love for the daughter he had just found. "What do you mean by strategic?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, "We've prepared a story. You are the daughter of my deceased wife's younger sister. You were raised in a convent in Scotland after your parents died, which explains your unfamiliarity with society. You've come to live with me now that you've reached your majority." The lie sat heavy between them. Elena understood the necessity of it, but it still stung to have her entire life erased and rewritten to fit other people's expectations. "And my markings?" she asked, unconsciously touching her covered arm. "We'll say they're remnants of a childhood illness, scarring from a fever that nearly took your life. It's not uncommon, and it explains why you keep them covered." Elena nodded slowly. It was a good story, believable and simple, but it meant denying everything she truly was, everything her grandmother had taught her to value about their heritage. "I know this is difficult," Marcus said, his voice gentle, "but it's temporary. Once you're established in society, once people know and accept you, we can gradually reveal more of the truth." "And if they never accept me?" Elena asked. "What if I can never be the daughter you need me to be?" Marcus reached across the space between them and took her hand, his own scarred from years of sword work. "Elena, you already are everything I could have hoped for in a daughter. You're brave. Anyone who survived what you've survived has courage beyond measure. You're intelligent. I can see it in your questions and observations. And you have your grandmother's strength, her ability to endure." He squeezed her hand gently. "All I'm asking is that you let me protect you the way I should have been protecting you all these years." That evening, Elena joined Marcus for dinner in his private dining room, a smaller, more intimate space than the grand formal room. They ate mostly in comfortable silence, both still adjusting to this new relationship, both uncertain of how to bridge 23 years of absence. It was Marcus who finally broke the quiet. "Tell me about her," he said. "Tell me about Rosa in those last years." Elena set down her fork, thinking about where to begin. "She was the strongest person I ever knew," she said finally. "Even when the village turned against her, even when she knew they were coming for her, she never showed fear, at least, not where I could see it." She told him about her grandmother's work as a healer, about the people who would sneak to their cottage in the dark of night seeking remedies for ailments their doctors couldn't cure. She told him about the garden Rosa had tended, filled with plants that grew in impossible combinations, as if magic itself helped them thrive. "She never spoke of bitterness toward you," Elena said. "When she mentioned you at all, it was with love. She used to say that some people are meant for great things, and it would be selfish to hold them back from their destiny." Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "I should have found a way," he said. "I should have come back for her." "She knew you would have if you could," Elena replied. "That's why she never told you about me. She didn't want you to choose between duty and love. She thought it would destroy you." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thoughts of Rosa and the sacrifices she had made. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "There's something I need to tell you about tomorrow," he said, his tone growing more serious. "One of the guests will be Colonel Hartwell. He's someone you should be careful around." Elena waited for him to continue. "Hartwell is ambitious, and he sees me as an obstacle to his own advancement. He's been looking for ways to undermine my position for years. If he suspects there's anything irregular about your background, he'll investigate until he finds the truth." "What would happen if he found out?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "At best, it would end my career," Marcus said grimly. "At worst, if he discovered the truth about your markings, about Rosa's abilities. Elena, there are still laws on the books about witchcraft. They're rarely enforced in these modern times, but for someone like Hartwell, who believes might makes right, they could be a convenient weapon." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You're saying I could be arrested? Tried for witchcraft?" "Not if I have anything to say about it," Marcus said firmly. "But yes, the possibility exists. That's why we need to be so careful about how we handle your introduction to society." That night, Elena lay in her comfortable bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the impossible situation she found herself in. She had gone from being a homeless outcast to the daughter of a general, but the danger hadn't decreased. It had simply changed form. She thought about her grandmother's journal, about the strength Rosa had shown in the face of persecution. She thought about her father's guilt and his desperate desire to protect her, and she thought about tomorrow, when she would have to put on a performance that could determine the course of the rest of her life. Elena rose from bed and went to the window, looking out at the estate grounds bathed in moonlight. Somewhere out there were people who would judge her not for who she was, but for how well she could pretend to be someone else. And among them would be someone actively looking for ways to destroy her father. She touched the pendant at her throat, the one with Marcus's initials that she had worn since childhood without understanding its significance. Tomorrow she would meet the people who inhabited her father's world, and she would have to convince them that she belonged there too. But even as she prepared herself for the performance ahead, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how carefully they planned, no matter how convincing their story, the truth had a way of revealing itself. Her grandmother had always said that secrets, like seeds, eventually found their way to the surface. As if responding to her thoughts, the markings on her arm began to tingle slightly, the way they sometimes did when she was stressed or emotional. Elena rubbed the spot gently, hidden beneath her nightgown sleeve, and wondered if Rosa was watching over her somehow, trying to send her guidance across the veil between worlds. The next day arrived gray and drizzling, matching Elena's mood as she prepared for the evening ahead. Marcus had arranged for a woman from town to help her with the finer points of formal dress and deportment. Mrs. Whitmore was kind but efficient, showing Elena how to move in the elaborate gown Marcus had commissioned, how to hold her teacup properly, how to make the sort of polite conversation expected at such gatherings. "Remember, my dear," Mrs. Whitmore said as she arranged Elena's hair, "the key is to listen more than you speak. Ask questions about others rather than offering information about yourself. Most people are so fond of talking about themselves that they'll consider you a delightful conversationalist if you simply encourage them to continue." Elena nodded, trying to absorb all the advice while battling the nervous energy that made her hands shake. The dress Marcus had chosen was beautiful, deep blue silk with long sleeves that completely covered her markings, but it felt like a costume, a visual lie she had to wear to play her part. As evening approached, Elena heard carriages beginning to arrive. The sound of voices and laughter drifted up from the main floor, making her stomach twist with anxiety. Soon Captain Morrison came to escort her downstairs. The drawing room was filled with people who seemed to Elena like creatures from another world. The men wore dress uniforms heavy with medals and insignia, while the women glittered in jewels and silk. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged and how to behave, speaking in a language of subtle gestures and coded phrases that Elena didn't understand. Marcus appeared at her side immediately, his presence both comforting and nerve-wracking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the room, "I'd like you to meet my niece, Elena Hartley. She's come to live with me after completing her education at St. Margaret's Convent in Edinburgh." Elena curtsied as Mrs. Whitmore had taught her, keeping her eyes downcast in what she hoped appeared to be modest shyness rather than terror. A chorus of polite greetings followed, and she found herself swept into a series of introductions that blurred together in a haze of names and titles. She was holding her own reasonably well, remembering Mrs. Whitmore's advice about asking questions and listening carefully when a man approached who made every instinct Elena possessed scream danger. Colonel Hartwell was tall and lean, with pale eyes that seemed to see everything and judge it harshly. When Marcus introduced them, Hartwell took Elena's gloved hand and held it just a moment too long, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "how interesting to meet you at last. Marcus has been remarkably quiet about having family." "Colonel?" Elena replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "My uncle has been very kind in welcoming me to his home." "St. Margaret's in Edinburgh, was it?" Hartwell continued, not releasing her hand. "I have some familiarity with the area. Which order runs that particular convent?" Elena's mind went blank. In all their preparation, they hadn't discussed such specific details. She felt Marcus tense beside her, but before either of them could respond, another voice interrupted. "The Sisters of Mercy, if I'm not mistaken," said a woman Elena recognized as Mrs. Wellington, the wife of another officer. "I have a cousin who attended there. Lovely school, very strict about proper deportment." Elena shot the woman a grateful look, but she could see the calculating expression in Hartwell's eyes. He had noticed her hesitation, and she suspected this wouldn't be his last probing question. The evening continued with Elena walking a tightrope of carefully crafted responses and deflected inquiries. But as the night wore on, she began to feel a strange sensation, a prickling awareness that had nothing to do with social anxiety. Her markings were growing warm. Elena tried to ignore the feeling, telling herself it was just nerves manifesting in a physical way. But as the sensation grew stronger, she began to notice other things. The way shadows seemed to gather in the corners of the room despite the bright lamplight. The way certain guests kept glancing toward the windows as if they saw something troubling in the darkness beyond. And most unsettling of all, the way Colonel Hartwell had begun watching her with an expression that went far beyond mere social curiosity. Elena excused herself to visit the powder room, needing a moment to collect herself. But as she stood in the small, mirror-lined space, she rolled up her sleeve to check her markings and nearly gasped at what she saw. The ink was glowing, not brightly, but with a soft blue-silver luminescence that pulsed gently in rhythm with her heartbeat. Elena stared at her reflection, remembering her grandmother's words about the markings being protection. But protection from what? A soft knock at the door made her quickly roll down her sleeve. "Miss Elena?" came Captain Morrison's voice. "Your uncle was wondering if you're feeling well." "Yes, I'll be right out," Elena called back, but her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. When she returned to the drawing room, she found the atmosphere had changed. Conversations had grown quieter, more intense. Several of the guests were standing near the windows, looking out into the night with troubled expressions. Marcus appeared at her side immediately. "We may need to cut this evening short," he murmured in her ear. "There are reports of unusual activity in the surrounding countryside." Elena's heart began to race. What kind of activity? Before Marcus could answer, Colonel Hartwell's voice cut across the room. "General Blackwood," he said loudly, drawing everyone's attention. "Perhaps you could explain to your guests why there appear to be lights moving through the forest without any natural source." Elena looked toward the windows and saw what had been troubling everyone. In the distance, strange blue-white lights danced among the trees, moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. They pulsed and swirled, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that Elena realized matched the tingling in her markings. "I'm sure it's nothing more than marsh gas or some other natural phenomenon," Marcus said calmly, but Elena could hear the tension in his voice. "How curious," Hartwell replied, his pale eyes fixed on Elena. "The lights began appearing just as we were having the pleasure of meeting your charming niece." What an interesting coincidence. The implication hung in the air like a threat. Elena felt every eye in the room turn toward her, and she realized with growing horror that whatever was happening outside was somehow connected to her presence here. The carefully constructed lie of her identity was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The markings on her arm pulsed stronger, and Elena had the sudden, terrifying realization that her grandmother's protection wasn't just a comfort or a memory. It was an active force, one that had been dormant all these years, but was now awakening in response to some threat she couldn't yet see. As if summoned by her thoughts, the lights in the forest began moving closer to the house. And Elena knew that the careful world Marcus had tried to build around her was about to shatter completely. The lights drew closer with each passing moment, and Elena could feel their pull like a tide in her blood. The markings on her arm were now burning with an intensity that made it hard to concentrate on anything else. Around her, the dinner guests murmured uneasily, some making excuses to leave while others pressed closer to the windows in morbid fascination. Colonel Hartwell stood at the center of the room like a predator scenting weakness. His pale eyes never left Elena's face, and she could see the moment when suspicion crystallized into certainty. "General Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man about to make an accusation, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about your niece." Marcus stepped protectively in front of Elena, his hand instinctively moving to where his sword would normally hang. "Colonel, I think you're overstepping your bounds." "Am I?" Hartwell smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Tell me, General, does your niece always attract supernatural phenomena? Or is tonight a special occasion?" The remaining guests fell silent, tension crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. Elena could feel their eyes on her, could sense their growing fear and suspicion. She knew that within moments, her carefully constructed identity would be completely destroyed. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of judgment from people who had never known hardship or persecution, something inside Elena began to shift. The fear that had dominated her life for so many years was still there, but it was being overshadowed by something else. Anger. These people, with their fine clothes and comfortable lives, were so quick to condemn what they didn't understand. They were ready to destroy her father's reputation and her own life based on nothing more than coincidence and prejudice. And suddenly, Elena found herself tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of apologizing for who she was. The lights outside pulsed brighter, and Elena realized they weren't random at all. They were responding to her emotions, feeding off her anger and growing stronger with each surge of righteous fury. "You want to know about the lights?" Elena said, her voice cutting through the murmurs and whispers. "You want to understand what's happening out there?" "Elena, don't," Marcus warned, but she was beyond caution now. Elena stepped out from behind her father's protective presence and faced Colonel Hartwell directly. "The lights are responding to me," she said clearly. "They're drawn to these." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing the intricate markings that glowed with the same blue-silver light that danced in the forest. Gasps echoed around the room, and she saw several women make signs against evil. But Elena no longer cared about their fear or their judgment. "These markings were given to me by my grandmother," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "A woman who was killed by people just like you. People who were afraid of anything they couldn't control or understand." Colonel Hartwell's eyes widened with triumph and something that looked almost like hunger. "Witchcraft," he breathed. "I knew there was something unnatural about you." "Is it unnatural to heal the sick?" Elena demanded. "To ease pain and suffering? To grow plants that provide medicine for those who can't afford doctors? Because that's what my grandmother did, and that's what these markings represent. Knowledge, healing, protection." She turned to address the room, meeting each person's eyes without flinching. "You all benefited from her work at some point, I guarantee it. When your children had fevers that wouldn't break, when infections threatened to kill your loved ones, when conventional medicine failed, you sought out people like my grandmother. But you called it coincidence when you recovered, and witchcraft only when it suited your fears." The lights outside were now circling the house, close enough that their glow cast moving shadows through the windows. Elena could feel their energy calling to something deep inside her, awakening abilities she had never fully understood. Marcus moved to stand beside his daughter, his face pale but resolute. "Elena," he said quietly, "whatever you're thinking of doing, be careful." "I'm not going to hurt anyone," Elena replied, though she wasn't entirely sure what was about to happen. "But I'm done pretending to be something I'm not." She walked to the largest window and placed her palm against the glass. The moment her skin made contact, the lights outside responded dramatically, rushing toward the house like moths to a flame. But instead of the chaos everyone expected, something beautiful happened. The lights began to form patterns in the air, intricate designs that mirrored the markings on Elena's arm. They danced and swirled, creating shapes that spoke of ancient knowledge and old wisdom. Some guests stepped back in fear, but others found themselves drawn forward, mesmerized by the ethereal display. "This is what you're so afraid of," Elena said, her voice carrying a new authority. "Beauty, wonder, the knowledge that there's more to this world than what you can see and measure and control." Colonel Hartwell recovered from his initial shock and stepped forward, his face twisted with disgust and ambition. "This confirms everything," he declared. "General Blackwood has been harboring a practicing witch under his roof. By law, she must be arrested and tried for crimes against God and nature." "By whose authority?" Marcus demanded, moving to stand protectively beside Elena once again. "By mine," Hartwell replied, pulling out an official-looking document from his jacket. "I came here tonight prepared for this possibility. I have a warrant signed by Magistrate Pemberton, giving me the authority to arrest and detain anyone found practicing supernatural arts." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night. She had been naive to think that speaking the truth would somehow protect her. Men like Hartwell didn't care about truth. They cared about power. But before the colonel could move toward her, Captain Morrison stepped into his path. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't allow you to arrest Miss Elena." Hartwell's face darkened with rage. "Stand down, Captain. That's an order." "With all due respect, Colonel." "I don't take orders from you," Morrison replied calmly. "I serve under General Blackwood, and until he gives me a direct order to the contrary, Miss Elena is under my protection." Other officers in the room began to stir uneasily, clearly torn between their respect for Hartwell's rank and their loyalty to Marcus. Elena could see the situation spiraling toward violence, and she knew she had to act. "Stop," she said, her voice carrying a power that made everyone freeze. "This doesn't have to end in bloodshed." She turned to Colonel Hartwell, meeting his hateful gaze without flinching. "You want me arrested? You want to put me on trial for witchcraft? Fine. But you should know what you're really dealing with first." Elena walked back to the window and pressed both palms against the glass. This time, she didn't just call to the lights. She reached out with abilities she had kept buried for years, abilities her grandmother had taught her to hide. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The lights outside exploded into brilliant patterns that filled the entire sky. But more than that, Elena could suddenly sense every living thing in the surrounding area. Every bird in the trees, every deer in the forest, every flower in the garden. She could feel their life force, their interconnectedness, the delicate balance that kept the natural world in harmony, and she could sense something else. Sickness and injury among Marcus's staff and soldiers. A cook suffering from arthritis that kept her awake at night. A stable boy with an infected wound he was hiding for fear of losing his job. A guard with a persistent cough that was getting worse each day. Without conscious thought, Elena reached out to them through the strange connection her markings provided. She didn't heal them, that would have required direct contact and specific herbs. But she eased their pain, reduced their discomfort, gave them the peaceful sleep they needed for their bodies to heal naturally. In the drawing room, several guests began to look confused, then amazed, as minor aches and pains they had carried for years simply faded away. An older woman who had been leaning heavily on a walking stick suddenly found she could stand straight and tall. A gentleman who had been squinting in the lamplight realized his vision had cleared remarkably. "You see," Elena said, turning back to face the room. "This is what you call evil. This is what you want to destroy. The ability to ease suffering and bring comfort to those in pain." Colonel Hartwell stared at her with a mixture of fear and rage. "Tricks," he spat. "Deception. You're manipulating these people somehow." "Am I?" Elena challenged. "Mrs. Hartford, how does your back feel? The pain you've carried since your riding accident 5 years ago?" The elderly woman stood straighter, tears streaming down her face. "It's gone," she whispered. "For the first time in years, it's completely gone." Similar murmurs of wonder and gratitude began to rise from around the room as people realized their various ailments had been mysteriously eased. But Elena could see that for every person filled with gratitude, there was another backing away in fear. "This proves nothing," Hartwell declared, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Witchcraft can be used for seemingly beneficial purposes, but it always comes with a price. How do we know what dark forces she's calling upon?" Elena felt her temper flare again, and the lights outside responded by burning brighter and moving faster. "Dark forces?" she repeated. "The only dark force in this room is your ignorance and hatred." She stepped toward Hartwell, and several people gasped as the air around her began to shimmer with energy. "You want to see something truly dark? Let me show you the future you're creating with your fear and persecution." Elena reached out with her abilities once more, but this time she touched the colonel's mind instead of his body. For just a moment, she let him experience what she had experienced, the loneliness of being rejected by everyone around you, the fear of sleeping rough in the rain, the desperation of knowing that no matter how good or helpful you tried to be, people would always see you as a threat. Hartwell staggered backward, his face white with shock. "What did you do to me?" he demanded. "I showed you empathy," Elena replied, "something you seem incapable of feeling on your own." But the demonstration had cost her. Elena felt her strength wavering, the connection to the lights outside beginning to fade. Using her abilities so intensively after keeping them suppressed for so long was taking its toll. Marcus caught her arm as she swayed slightly. "Elena, you need to stop. You're pushing yourself too hard." "I'm fine," she insisted, but they both knew it wasn't true. Colonel Hartwell recovered his composure quickly, and Elena could see the calculation in his eyes. He had witnessed her abilities firsthand now, had felt their power, and instead of being deterred, he seemed even more determined to destroy her. "This display only confirms my worst fears," he announced to the room. "We've seen what she can do when she chooses to be benevolent. But what happens when she decides to use these powers for revenge? For personal gain? For manipulation and control?" He turned to Marcus with triumphant malice. "General, your daughter is a threat to the stability and safety of this entire region. She must be contained before she becomes too dangerous to stop." The word daughter hung in the air like an accusation. Elena realized that in her emotional state, she had revealed more than she intended. The lie about being Marcus's niece was now exposed, adding another layer of deception to their already precarious situation. Marcus straightened to his full height, every inch the commanding general. "Colonel Hartwell," he said in a voice that could freeze fire, "you will not threaten my daughter. Not while I draw breath." "Your daughter?" Hartwell laughed harshly. "So now we have the full truth. The great General Blackwood, moral paragon of the King's army, has been hiding his bastard witch daughter and lying to his superiors about it. The scandal alone will end your career, even without the supernatural implications." Elena saw the pain in her father's eyes and felt a surge of protective rage. She had spent her entire life being rejected and feared, but she would not let this man destroy the father who had offered her love and acceptance. "You want to arrest someone for witchcraft?" she said, stepping forward again. "Then arrest me. But leave my father out of this. He didn't know I existed until 3 days ago." "Elena, no," Marcus said firmly. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my reputation. And I won't let you sacrifice your life's work for mine," Elena replied. She turned back to Hartwell. "I'll come with you willingly on one condition. You leave General Blackwood alone. This has nothing to do with him." Hartwell's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "How touching. But I'm afraid it's too late for negotiations. You're both coming with me." He signaled to 2 soldiers who had apparently been waiting outside, and Elena realized this entire evening had been a trap. Hartwell had suspected something before he even arrived, and he had come prepared to spring his web. But as the soldiers moved toward Elena and Marcus, something unexpected happened. Captain Morrison stepped in their path again, and this time he wasn't alone. Other officers who served under Marcus moved to stand with him, forming a protective barrier around Elena and her father. "I'm sorry, Colonel," Morrison said calmly, "but we can't allow you to arrest General Blackwood or his daughter without proper evidence of actual wrongdoing." "You're all witnesses to her supernatural abilities," Hartwell snarled. "What more evidence do you need?" "Evidence of harm," said Major Williams, another of Marcus's loyal officers. "We've seen her heal people, ease pain, create beauty. Where's the evidence that she's used these abilities to hurt anyone?" "The law doesn't require proof of harm," Hartwell replied. "The practice of witchcraft is illegal in itself." "Actually," said a new voice from the doorway, "that's not quite accurate." Everyone turned to see a distinguished older man in judicial robes enter the room. Elena didn't recognize him, but she could see the surprise and concern on Hartwell's face. "Judge Caldwell," Marcus said, relief evident in his voice. "What brings you here tonight?" "I received some very interesting reports about strange lights and supernatural activities," Judge Caldwell replied. "As the senior magistrate for this district, I felt it was my duty to investigate personally." He looked around the room, taking in the scene with keen eyes. "I've been watching from the garden for the past half hour, observing Miss Blackwood's abilities and their effects." Elena felt her heart sink. If a judge had witnessed everything, her fate was surely sealed. But Judge Caldwell's next words surprised her. "What I saw," he continued, "was a young woman using what appear to be natural healing abilities to ease the suffering of others. I saw no evidence of harmful magic, no summoning of dark forces, no threats to public safety. He turned to Colonel Hartwell with a stern expression. Colonel, the law requires that supernatural abilities be used for harmful purposes before they can be considered criminal. Healing the sick and comforting the afflicted hardly qualifies as criminal activity. Hartwell's face flushed with anger. But the old laws clearly state— The old laws, Judge Caldwell interrupted, were written in times of superstition and fear. They've been superseded by more modern statutes that require actual evidence of harm or malicious intent. Elena could hardly believe what she was hearing. For the first time in her life, someone in authority was defending her abilities rather than condemning them. Furthermore, the judge continued, I've been researching the historical context of such abilities, particularly in relation to traditional healing practices. There's growing recognition that what we once called witchcraft may simply be forms of medicine and therapy we don't yet fully understand. He looked at Elena with something that might have been respect. Miss Blackwood, your abilities appear to be a gift, not a curse. The question is not whether you should be punished for having them, but whether you can be taught to use them safely and beneficially for society. Colonel Hartwell's carefully laid plans were crumbling around him, and Elena could see his desperation growing. This is a travesty, he declared. You're all being deceived by supernatural manipulation. That witch is controlling your mind somehow. That's enough, Marcus said, his voice cutting through Hartwell's rant like a blade. Colonel, you've overplayed your hand. Your accusations have been proven groundless. Your warrant is based on outdated laws, and your behavior tonight has been disgraceful. He stepped forward, and Elena was struck by the complete authority in his bearing. This was General Marcus Blackwood in his full power, and even Hartwell seemed to recognize the threat. You came here tonight hoping to destroy my daughter and my reputation, Marcus continued. Instead, you've revealed yourself as a man driven by petty jealousy and dangerous prejudice. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the King's Council about your conduct. You can't threaten me, Hartwell blustered, but his confidence was clearly shaken. I'm not threatening you, Marcus replied calmly. I'm informing you of the consequences of your actions. Judge Caldwell, I assume you'll be including Colonel Hartwell's behavior in your report? Indeed I will, the judge confirmed. Attempting to arrest citizens based on superseded laws and personal prejudice is a serious breach of duty. Elena watched as the man who had seemed so powerful and threatening just moments ago deflated like a punctured balloon. His soldiers, seeing which way the wind was blowing, began to back away from him. Even his own supporters in the room were distancing themselves from his obvious defeat. But Elena knew this wasn't really over. Men like Hartwell didn't give up easily, and she had made a powerful enemy tonight. Still, for the first time in her life, she had found herself supported by people in positions of power. Her father, his loyal officers, and even a judge had stood up for her right to exist and use her abilities. The lights outside began to fade as Elena's emotional state calmed, returning to their gentle pulse. The guests who remained, those who hadn't fled in fear or disgust, began to murmur among themselves about the extraordinary events they had witnessed. Elena found herself suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation now leaving her drained. Marcus noticed immediately and guided her to a chair, his concern evident. I'm proud of you, he said quietly so only she could hear. You showed more courage tonight than most soldiers show in battle. Elena looked up at her father, seeing the love and acceptance in his eyes, and felt something inside her finally heal. For 23 years, she had wondered what it would feel like to have a parent who truly knew and accepted who she was. Now she knew. What happens now? She asked. Marcus glanced around the room, then back at her. Now we figure out how to build a life where you don't have to hide who you are. It won't be easy, and there will always be people like Hartwell who fear what they don't understand. But tonight proves something important. What's that? That there are more good people in the world than bad ones. It just sometimes takes a crisis to reveal who's who. Judge Caldwell approached them, his expression thoughtful. Miss Blackwood, I wonder if I might speak with you about your abilities. I'm working with several other progressive jurists to establish new guidelines for handling cases involving supernatural talents. Your cooperation could help protect others like yourself in the future. Elena looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. I'd be honored to help, she said. As the evening finally wound down and the remaining guests departed, most with looks of wonder and respect rather than fear, Elena found herself alone with her father in his study. The fire crackled peacefully in the grate, and the strange events of the evening seemed almost like a dream. Do you regret it? Elena asked. Acknowledging me publicly? Defending me? Your reputation will never be the same. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Elena, for 23 years I've carried the guilt of believing I failed the woman I loved and the child I never got to know. Tonight I learned that my daughter inherited not just Rosa's abilities but her courage and her compassion. He turned to look at her, and Elena saw tears in his eyes. My reputation was built on duty and honor. But what honor is there in denying your own child? What duty is higher than protecting those who need protection? Elena felt her own tears starting to fall. I love you too, Father. Marcus crossed to her chair and knelt beside it, taking her hands in his. Elena, I want you to know that whatever happens from now on, you're not alone anymore. You're not an outcast or a refugee. You're my daughter, and you have a place in this world that no one can take away from you. Outside, the last of the strange lights faded away, returning the night to normal darkness. But inside the study, Elena felt a warmth and peace she had never experienced before. She thought of her grandmother, of the sacrifices Rosa had made, and the love she had shown, and she knew that somehow, somewhere, Rosa was smiling. The markings on Elena's arm had returned to their normal appearance, but she could still feel their power humming quietly beneath her skin. They were no longer a source of shame or fear, but a connection to her heritage and her abilities. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new people to convince, new prejudices to overcome. But tonight, for the first time in her life, Elena Blackwood was exactly where she belonged, with family who loved her for who she truly was, not in spite of it. And that, she realized, was the most powerful magic of all. 6 months later, Elena stood in the garden behind her father's estate, tending to the medicinal herbs she had planted there. The garden had become famous throughout the region, not for its supernatural properties, but for the remarkable healing results Elena achieved using traditional methods combined with her intuitive understanding of plants and their properties. People came from miles around seeking her help, and Elena had learned to work within the bounds of accepted medicine while still using her unique gifts. Judge Caldwell had been true to his word, establishing new legal protections for those with supernatural abilities, provided they used them constructively. Colonel Hartwell had been quietly transferred to a remote posting where his prejudices could do less damage. There were still those who viewed Elena with suspicion or fear, but they were increasingly outnumbered by those who had benefited from her healing work. Marcus appeared at the garden gate, as he did most afternoons, bringing her tea and updates on the day's events. Their relationship had grown stronger with each passing month, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. "Any interesting visitors today?" he asked, settling on the bench Elena had placed under her grandmother's favorite tree, a sapling she had grown from seeds found in Rosa's journal. "Mrs. Patterson brought her grandson. Elena replied, accepting the tea gratefully. The boy who was born with the twisted foot, he's walking normally now. Marcus smiled. And how are you feeling about the invitation from the Royal Academy? Elena had been asked to present her work to a gathering of physicians and natural philosophers in the capital. It was both an honor and a terrifying prospect, but she was beginning to believe she could handle whatever came next. Nervous, she admitted, but ready. If we want things to change, someone has to be willing to stand up and show that people like me can use our gifts for good. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over the estate that had become Elena's true home. In the distance, she could see the lights of the town where she was no longer an outcast, but a respected healer. It was a different kind of magic than what her grandmother had taught her, but it was magic nonetheless. The transformation of fear into understanding, hatred into acceptance, exile into belonging. Elena touched the pendant at her throat, the one with her father's initials, and smiled. Some stories she had learned had happy endings after all.